joined our PhD program in 2010 as an Americanist, and he contacted me the summer before we were about to join the program and said that he was interested in one of my courses on treaty courts. And now you can see one of the reasons why I'm here now, speaking in front of you. And I said, well, why don't you take my course in treaty courts if you're interested? And he said, well, it is a course conflict. So can you have an independent reading course with me, Joe asked through email. And I said, well, perhaps. And I thought this thing would drop there. But it seemed that Joe wasn't the person who would take a no for an answer, so he got back to me until I just gave in and had an independent reading course on the treaty courts, paralleling my course. And it was in this conversation that I realized Joe's extremely strong interest in photography, the missionary experience, the American mission experience in China. This discussion, you know, after a while felt more like an ongoing discussion between two colleagues, or one historian and a future historian that sits in this room now. So Joe advanced quickly into our PhD program and advanced into full candidacy. He worked as my teaching assistant, and then as he started to develop his project, every once in a while he would show up at my office hours and say, here, have a little crate of slides that one of the people I'm interviewing for my dissertation on Chinese, on US missionaries in China. And I looked at these pictures like, oh wow, I'm not even sure no one's ever seen this. Yeah, I have color ones too. Okay, and when are these from? Well, 1947. Wow. And you know, I felt that this was a one-time only, and then he would uncover color footage from Beijing, right about the time of the communist takeover in 1949. And I started to encourage Joe to, you have to preserve this. This is something that most people haven't seen, and I was just mentioning to one of my colleagues here that a lot of the footage and a lot of the visual evidence that we have from China from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is usually the same thing over and over again. I said, Joe, you can really make a contribution to this. So Joe started to locate and preserve and acquire material, and some of it is now deposited at the University of Michigan. And also Joe, through his dissertation research on the missionary modernity and its relationship to photography, also developed a personal network of people who had been in China during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and their children. And some of those people are now in this room today at this reunion of the Shanghai American School. I'm not going to go on and delve more into Joe's dissertation, but this dissertation has earned him a job at Albion College in East Asian history. The dissertation is a transnational history of the making and vernacular missionary modernity through the practice of photography in the first half of the 20th century. And this, in the course of his research, has not only meant that Joe has developed the network to have this conference. They have 4 articles, 3 of which are peer-reviewed. He has co-edited a publication of War and Occupation in China, Letters of an American Missionary from Hangzhou, 1937-1938, which is co-edited with Charlie Bright, who is sitting here in front of us and is going to present later, and also, of course, is the organizer of this conference. Now, before I allow Joe to continue the opening remarks, I think that today we're in a moment of uncertainty in US-China relations. I think this is something that's on the back of our minds constantly as we follow the news, and all of us who've been to China care about China and its relationship to the United States and the rest of the world. And I think this conference is on one hand a rare opportunity for alumni of the Shanghai American schools to get together and discuss experiences, but it's also a moment for us to perhaps reflect on deeper patterns and deeper lessons of US-China relations that go beyond the current moment. It just struck me that today, only a couple of years ago, it was a very odd experience to have gone to school in China. But now, since China's opened up to the rest of the world, and we now have several generations of students that have a similar experience that many of you have in this room, that have spent some of your formative years in a school in China. Many of those students are actually coming to our classes now which represent a totally new demographic for us as teachers, that only 20 years ago or 15 years ago, most students that came to our classes and took lessons in East Asian history have perhaps been to China in summer, or perhaps have visited, or have a parent have been there. Now they come to our office hours and say, you know, I've been going to an American school in Beijing for a year. They might be fluent in Chinese, have a significant experience. So there are a lot of continuities that we should ponder upon. I'm also very happy that we have former U.S. Ambassador Stephen Roy attended the conference, who's going to deliver the keynote remarks later today. So this is a little bit about the background, a little bit about myself and the major organizer of this conference, and I'm now going to give the word to Joseph Ho to continue the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Pär, for those very generous opening introduction. Just to give a kind of little bit of background, when I first started that reading course that Pär mentioned, I was extremely intimidated of him. I was quaking in my boots when he was grilling me on Chinese history and all sorts of details. So I never would have dreamed that he'd be here in this conference giving these opening remarks. So really, this relationship has built over the years. And of course, I never would have dreamed that all of you would be here all together in this reunion, also thinking about changes over time in Chinese history, the role of experience and memory and historical material in how we interpret and react to Chinese history and US-China contact. And I want to welcome you all here and really thank all of you for being here and being present. And many of you have supported or encouraged me over the years in ways very large and small. Some of your families have given material. Your conversations have been tremendously enriching and encouraging. So I want to give a shout out and a thank you to all of you who have played a role in the studies that I do. And I hope I can give something back, a little bit, just a small thing, back to all of you. And before we continue with the program, I would like to thank the organizers who have been behind the Shanghai American School Reunion, Mimi Hollister-Gardner, Anne Romasco, David Angus and Garth Angus, and Carl Scoville, who took the time to teleconference with me, to work across distance and time and technology to make this possible. So without them, really, this event would not be happening today. So thank you so much. And without further ado, we will continue with the panels and start talking and thinking about Republican China in peace and war. Thank you.
All right, so I have the honor of the chair of this panel. So I have the honor to introduce Professor Emeritus Ernest Young, who's going to give a presentation on the treaty ports. Ernest Young is the author of a very widely acclaimed biography of Yuan Shih-k'ai, the first president of the Republic of China. Also recently published a book about the Ecclesiastical Colony. It's about French language or French-speaking missionaries, Catholic missionaries in China. And he's also my predecessor in the department, so giving him a heartfelt welcome.
Surface here. Well, my role today here is to sketch in some of the institutional and legal history of Sino-foreign relations that was part of the context for the Shanghai American School in World War II. In order to do that coherently, I must expand the title of the panel to include the last decades of the pre-Republican imperial order, that is the Qing dynasty and its government, which ended in 1912. It was from the middle decades of the 19th century that the agreements and institutions shaping Sino-foreign relations emerged, and with some adjustments lasted until World War II, and in a very limited measure, even beyond the end of that war, until the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. I shall be brief, since I'm sure in this audience there is much previous knowledge of this story, so please indulge me if it's too familiar. The best known part of the story is the beginning in the 1840s of a new relationship between the Chinese state and Western countries, with Great Britain in the lead. The key events, well known, the Opium War between Britain and China at the beginning of that decade, and then the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860, in which France joined Britain. The settlement of these two wars instituted a long-lived set of privileges for nationals of these and then other Western countries. These foreigners were allowed by treaty right to reside in designated cities of China and were granted immunity from the Chinese administration of law. This was called extraterritoriality, and an aspect was that the protected foreigner who became a defendant in any case would be tried by a consul or a court of his own country and by his own country's law, a privilege known as consular jurisdiction. There were no such rights granted to Chinese residents in these same Western countries, hence the appellation unequal treaties to the forced agreements that established the system. Added to these special rights were negotiated zones for foreign residents in or next to some of the most of the important cities that were listed in the treaties. The administrative rules for these zones were elaborated over time, but tended toward the creation of small municipalities within the larger city, zones that were largely foreign-run, even when they soon acquired large numbers of Chinese residents. These zones were usually called concessions, often with a national character, such as the French concession in Shanghai. An exception was the international settlement in Shanghai, an amalgam of original British and American concessions, where the nationals of other foreign countries were allowed to participate in the governments. Japan joined the lineup of privileged countries partially in 1871 and then fully in 1895 after a victorious war with China. And Japan participated in the Shanghai's international settlement and created its own concessions in some other cities. One can imagine the complications and confusions to which these arrangements gave rise. They are brilliantly elucidated by Pär Cassel, our chair today, in his book, Grounds of Judgement, Extraterritorial and Imperial Power in 19th Century China and Japan. He makes the important point that officials of the Chinese Empire played a significant role in fashioning this resulting treaty system. Treating a resident minority according to different arrangements from those pertaining to the majority of the Chinese population was conceivable, even familiar to these officials in terms of historical precedent. Indeed, it was integral to the special legal status of Manchus, a minority ethnic group who supplied the Qing emperor. So from the Chinese point of view, the problem of these rules that I've just been outlined a bit was not so much in the theory, although they eventually discovered the departure of these arrangements from West's own international law. Not so much in the theory as it was in the practice. The practice included the repeated expansion of foreign privilege beyond the treaties and the biased settlement of conflicts under military threat. Many Chinese eventually learned to hate the treaty system, even though some found ways it could be used for their own purposes. An aspect of the story of the unequal treaty system that is sometimes neglected, even when briefly mentioned, is the particular role of the French state in all this. It's worth noticing, if only because the Shanghai American School moved in 1923 from a site in the international settlement to one in the Shanghai French concession, where it remained until the middle of World War II. Despite its name, the French concession didn't exclude non-French nationalities. Indeed, in the 1930s, more Americans lived in the French concession than lived in the international settlement in Shanghai. So, to the French. At the time of the Opium War, in the early 1840s, France, slightly late onto the scene, was eager to catch up with Britain as a player in China. It sent an envoy with a naval escort, negotiated its own treaty with China, and some more treaties after a victory in the Second Opium War. rivalry with England was an old theme with France and was quite self-consciously imported onto the Chinese scene after 1860. The problem, as its diplomats perceived it, was France's lack of substantial trade in China, and hence a deficiency in bargaining chips in the contest for a dominant political position in the country. Early on, France identified its most promising political role as that of protecting Catholics in China, both foreign and Chinese Catholics. French authorities interpreted the treaties ending the Second Opium War as the legal basis for such a role, even though it was not specified in the treaty as such. The material for this program was the pre-existence of Chinese Catholic communities scattered over most of the country. This was the residue of some 260 years of Catholic evangelism in China, which had persisted haltingly even through the 120 years of the proscription of the religion by Chinese law. There followed in the 19th century a swelling corps of European Catholic missionaries in the country after the official decriminalization of Catholicism by the Emperor in 1844. Although there had long been Chinese Catholic priests as part of the Catholic establishment in China, as well as the European missionaries, conveniently for the French, all the bishops, 100% of the bishops, were Western. This condition of an unanimously European character to the bishops in the Chinese Catholic Church, this persisted until the late 1920s and was only partially remedied before 1949. So this allowed French diplomats to respond to any bishop's request for assistance in dealing with Chinese authority as if it were protecting a national. They asserted this right even though many of the bishops, though European, were not French, but nevertheless registered as French for legal purposes. An interesting little game they were playing. And all the European clergy enjoyed impunity from Chinese law. French authorities even extended a protective arm at the behest of the European clergy to Chinese Catholics. On top of this, France managed to get the Chinese government to allow Catholic missionaries to establish residence and buy land and erect buildings in any part of the country. This is a time when other foreigners, non-missionary foreigners, were allowed to establish residence only in the vicinity of a limited list of cities specified in treaties and other formal arrangements. This was certainly a formula for trouble, and there was lots of it. As the number of missionaries and Chinese Catholics swelled, disputes and violent incidents proliferated. French diplomats would then exact large indemnities to compensate the missions and the Chinese Catholics who had been damaged. And these same diplomats often sought and secured the dismissal of Chinese officials who were blamed for allowing the incidents to occur. Protestant missionaries, who unlike the Catholics were new to China in the 19th century, successfully lobbied their governments for similar rights and privileges, including setting up shop in any part of the country they wished. This was a poisonous brew. The Boxer Uprising at the turn of the century was the most conspicuous fallout, in which hundreds of foreigners and tens of thousands of Chinese Christians were killed. A dimension of this expansion of a privileged Christian missionary presence then added to the complications. A dimension that added to the complications was the hostility between Catholics and Protestants. In effect, Westerners were transferring their own domestic divisiveness into the Chinese context. Think Sunni and Shia in Islam as an analogy. We learn about the European wars of religion after the Reformation, but are inclined to think that such acting out was subsumed in a growing secularization in the 19th century. But among a portion of believers, the bitterness persisted. A recent study of French attitudes at the turn of the 20th century has the title, in my translation, A Forgotten Hate, It explores the vitriol aimed at Protestants in France for their alleged lack of patriotism, their subversive support of Germans, their criminal defense of Dreyfus, and so forth. In my own research in both Catholic and Protestant missionary documents from the early 20th century, I found abundant evidence of extreme hostility, including the invariable habit of denying the description Christian to the opposing tradition, instead using epithets like emissaries of the devil, the whore of Babylon, and so forth. This hostility was communicated to the Chinese adherents on both sides. The result was sometimes bloody encounters between Chinese Catholics and Chinese Protestants, with deaths on both sides. One Catholic report from a coastal province in the early 20th century reported that while the local bandits had recently put down their weapons, the Protestants were still armed and dangerous. That sort of thing. Lots of that in the text at that time. This Protestant-Catholic embroilment was sharpened by its overlap with the rivalry between France and Britain, with the Americans seen as allies of the British. French authorities were regularly seeking ways to challenge the British predominance among foreign powers in the large Yangtze River Valley. They carried this imagined contest all the way to the interior western province of Sichuan, where France fancied it had priority, owing to French interests flowing out of their Indochina colony into Yunnan province, which was Sichuan's southern neighbor. The Catholic presence in these places was France's main instrument for asserting its power. Unquestioning, sometimes I would say unthinking support by French diplomats for Catholic complaints from these places was a consequence of this mixture of politics and religion. Incidentally, the French government occasionally felt the need to tell the Pope not to interfere. Hey, Leo, Pius, Benedict, butt out. We're in charge here. We don't want your interference. One further wrinkle in this story is the stance of France in the mid-20th century war in East Asia. Like other Western powers, when Japan launched a full-scale attack on China in 1937, France did not choose sides. Then in 1940, France was invaded by Germany and a new French government appeared in the city of Vichy. The French diplomatic establishment in China accepted the new Vichy authority, despite deferring on many issues to the German overlord, which was occupying Paris and the north of France. The Vichy French government refused to recognize the puppet governance of Chinese politicians being put in place by Japan on Chinese soil, notably the Wang Qingwei regime. It was seated in the former nationalist capital of Nanjing. Even after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 41, the Vichy government insisted on its continuing neutrality in the Sino-Japanese war that was all around them. In January 1943, the British and American governments wooed China with the renunciation of their unequal treaties. The Japanese government had just previously announced surrender of its treaty rights, though it was in military occupation of the major cities of China. The Vichy government, the French Vichy government, followed suit in February 1943 with an announcement of intent to renounce the treaties and its concessions, but ambiguously, with no effective beginning date for this to actually happen. Under Japanese pressure, however, it soon passed on its Shanghai concession to the local Chinese authorities, who were Japanese appointees. But still, without the French formally recognizing the Wang Qingwei regime. It was a complicated dance here of trying to get through the middle of all this trouble, I guess. Personnel from the French concession continued to have some function in the new municipal structure. It was just being set up from 43 until just near the end of the war, when a few other things happened. Then with the German retreat from France and the end of the Vichy government, the new Gaullist French government declared the renunciation of France's treaties that the Vichy government had announced to be void. Like everything else the Vichy government had decreed, it was scratched. no longer work, because that was an illegal government. The Vichy government never really had any authority, according to the successor French government. So that little act in 43 was now moot or out. And then Japan surrendered in August 1945. So, from a French point of view, extraterritoriality lived. And the French concession could be recovered with the end of the war. Well, this French optimism, I don't know how widespread it was, but it was there in French official at the time. This didn't last. It was a new world post-World War II. And soon the treaties and the concessions would be surrendered again for the second time by France in 46. Well, I wonder how all this entangled and confusing politics was understood at the Shanghai American School, which is right in the middle of this, which after Pearl Harbor changed its name, as you may know, first to the American Private School and then alighting the American identification to the Jabe Civilian Assembly Camp School, a product of the internment of Allied nationals. What were relations like with the French authorities in the French concession before its retrocession? Perhaps there are some here today who have information on this. Anyway, resurrection was to come with the end of the war, and congratulations to those who managed that restoration. Thank you, that's all I have to say.
The next speaker is Professor Emeritus of History Charlie Bright, who is the author of several books on U.S. global relations and also a book on Detroit, and co-editor of Joseph Ho's volume on missionary diary in China and Hangzhou. So without further ado, please, Charlie.
Just off a transatlantic flight and a bit scratchy. You'll pardon me if I cough and scratch through this talk. Also, I am by no stretch of the imagination a Chinese specialist. I was not trained in anything to do with China. And I have only the most vague connections to the Shanghai American School, which I will try to outline. I'm here because 20 years ago I discovered a bundle of about 70 letters in a little-known archive of the Southern Presbyterian Church in Montreat, North Carolina, that were written by my grandfather, who was a missionary in China from 1911 until the Japanese interned him in 1943 in Hangzhou. And these letters, all 70 some odd, were written in a single year between September 1937 and August 1938, which is, of course, the year that the war broke out in Shanghai, spread to the Yangtze Valley, and led to the occupation of Nanjing and Hangzhou in December 1937, and then into the untoward world of Japanese occupation. My grandfather was a president of the Hangzhou Red Cross, chairman of the International Committee in Hangzhou, and an acting president of the what was then called the Hangzhou Christian College. So he had a lot of dealings with the Japanese. And these letters were written twice weekly to his wife back in Lexington, Kentucky, where she'd gone to avoid the war, written twice weekly describing in detail his preparations for and then dealing with the occupation by Japanese forces. I had no idea what to do with these letters until Ernie actually helped convince me that they had some historical value. And then I was lucky enough to run into Joe, who has Chinese and knows the history of missionary work in inner China. And so together, Joe and I edited these letters, annotating them with names, dates, events, and so forth to make them intelligible. And while that was happening, I did an archival project to resurrect my grandfather's career, about which I knew very little. And it is the result of some of that research I want to share today to do with education. My grandparents, Emma and Robert McMullen, went out to China in 1911 as newlyweds. Having never left the American South in their life, they went to China to be missionaries. They were sent by the Southern Presbyterian Church, as evangelists. And for the first 15 years in China, they did what most evangelist missionaries did. They studied Chinese, they organized congregations, they ministered to their congregations, they preached the gospel, they baptized, the regular missionary stuff. There was some exceptional qualities to my grandfather's career. He was serious about mastering the language, and by all accounts became quite fluent and could operate in a Chinese-speaking environment very easily. He was also very effective as a business manager, and so he was made in charge of construction projects. He worked on flood relief and various kinds of things for the Chinese government. But for the most part, he was part of that general generation of new Protestant missionaries that went out to China in the first 2 decades of the 20th century to, as they said, evangelize the world in this generation. He was part of a doubling of the number of Protestant missionaries in China between 1905 and 1920, which went from 3,000 to over 6,000 Protestant missionaries, peaking out in 1925 with 8,000 Protestant missionaries on the ground. All of them, in many ways, better educated than their predecessors as missionaries, trained in what was called the higher biblical criticism, familiar with the social gospel back home, and deeply affected by the First World War, and particularly by Woodrow Wilson's treatment of the Chinese at the Paris Peace Conference. My grandfather called it unchristian behavior. And as a result of that, began to rethink the long-standing conceit that had the West as the superior civilization because it was Christian. That combination had to be rethought, in my grandfather's opinion, in light not only of the war and the horrors of modern warfare by so-called civilized nations, but also to ensure a future for Christianity and the Christian missions in China. A friend of his wrote to him right after the war, "The first necessity of post-war Christian missionary work in China is to differentiate more clearly between Christianity and Western civilization, and to propagate one apart from the other." And my grandfather wrote, "Too often, missionaries have evaluated their work in terms of the change from Chinese customs to Western customs, from Chinese ideas to Western ideas, and this has animated a disrespect for China and its culture that inhibits the building of a Christian church in China." So this delinking of Christianity from an exclusive association with the West and of Western civilization was a way to make Christianity more relevant to Chinese conditions, to align it with Chinese aspirations for an autonomous future, and to make Christianity relevant in a Chinese context. And this opened, as I studied his career, the intellectual door to a kind of Christian internationalism, which rejected nationalism of all kinds, and in particular the exceptionalist vision of the America as a Christian nation with a global mission. And this, by extension, led to a critique of the state-centered League of Nations world order that was vested in white or Western supremacy and reserved the right of nation-states to fight one another in God's name, and led to a kind of militant pacifism that was linked back to the social gospel back home, and was part of my grandfather's intellectual outlook during the 20s and the 1930s. This new missionary position, as it emerged in the course of the 1920s, among many, but by no means all, Protestant missionaries, entailed two key corollaries to mission work. First, it meant if you're going to make Christianity fungible to a Chinese reality, it not only had to be detached from the demands for conversion to Western ways, but it had to be also more fully Chinese, that is, an indigenous institution. And a lot of my grandfather's writings in the 20s and early 30s is about the growing conviction that China would be evangelized by Chinese, not by Westerners. And that had certain doctrinal concessions that followed suit. The Chinese Christian church had to be autonomously governed by the Chinese Christians in a cultural idiom that would condition practices in ways that were not necessarily under missionary control or to their liking. That is, giving over control of the practices of a Chinese Christian church to Chinese Christians out of control of missionary supervision. And it meant also an ecumenical church, because Chinese Christian pastors and elders were not particularly attuned to the doctrinal differences among denominations, Well, for example, why Presbyterians and Baptists differed over baptismal practices. This was not something that culturally resonated with Chinese Christians, and so ecumenical work, crossing the divisions between Protestant denominations, became increasingly an important thing. The formation then in the 1920s of the Chinese-led Interdenominational Church of Christ in China was a manifestation of these developments of a kind of indigenous Chinese Christian church, which my grandfather heartily endorsed, as he served as one of the secretaries of this church throughout his career and was associated with other modernist associations that he had in China, with the Ecumenical Chinese YMCA, which he was very involved in, and also the National Christian Council of China. So indigenization, is that a word you like? Indigenization went hand in hand with a second corollary, which was the increasing involvement of Protestant Christian missionaries in educational work. Originally, Protestant missionaries founded schools for the children of Chinese Christians in their congregation. But in the 1920s, as the conversion rate increased, and as this movement to turn over the management of the Chinese Christian church to Chinese elders, pastors, and lay leaders, the Protestant Christian missionaries moved into higher education, establishing and developing colleges, 13 of them in the Yangtze Valley, to train Christian leadership for the Autonomous Church of Christ in China. That is, pastors who could administer the churches, elders and lay leaders who could run the government and make it a self-sufficient church. And this led to the foundation of seminaries, but most famous being the United Theological Seminary in Nanjing, China, which was a multi-denominational effort. So this was to train pastors and elders for an autonomous indigenous Chinese Christian church. My grandfather, Robert McMullen, was in full step with all of these developments, it turns out. In Hangzhou in the 1920s, he was the Mid-China Missions. That was the Southern Presbyterian Church mission field south of the Yangtze River, Mid-China Mission. He was their representative on the board of directors of the Hangzhou Christian College. And in the late 20s, he was slated to go to Nanjing as a professor of New Testament at the Theological Seminary there, training pastors for the Christian Church of China. And at the last minute, he was sent instead, in 1929, to be the provost and comptroller of the Hangzhou Christian College to work with the new Chinese president of that college. And this was part of the so-called registration controversy of the late 20s and early 30s, where the nationalist regime, having unified China and established its capital in Nanjing, sought to regularize a national educational system by requiring all foreign educational institutions to conform to certain stipulations. The most important being that their president should be Chinese and a majority of their board of directors should be Chinese. And in addition, that religious courses were no longer to be required as part of the curriculum. Although they could still do Bible study and religious courses, they were not part of the requirements of graduation any longer. And my grandfather was fully in step with this registration move. In my opinion, he wrote, the function of a mission college should be stated in terms that should be the function of every college. Nothing special about a Christian college. It should be like every other college in its mission and its principles. And in this view, he was guided by the famous Layman's Inquiry report of 1932. I don't know if you've heard of this. Toured China and looked at various aspects of the Protestant missionary work. And with respect to mission colleges, this Layman's report stressed, and I'm quoting, the danger of subordinating the educational to the religious objectives of the college, particularly in the appointment of faculty, and went on to urge that a priority be given to the education of the youth of China over the propagation of Christianity in these colleges. China's needs in building a new unified nation, not the aspiration of Western missionaries in China, were to be the paramount concern of Christian colleges in China. McMullen fully expected that religion could still be taught on these campuses and Bible study could go on, but it would not be part of graduation requirements any longer. And so the challenge he saw was to develop ways of witnessing Christianity in the context of a modern university that was serving the future consolidation of an independent, united China. And as the enrollment in these Protestant colleges grew, it went from about 2,000 in the mid-20s to over 7,000 by the mid-1930s. The overwhelming majority of the faculty teaching in these colleges were Chinese, and the overwhelming majority of students attending these colleges were no longer Christian, and their demands was for a modern education, commensurate with the practical and material needs of China, which meant teaching more science and engineering as part of the curriculum of these colleges. Arguably, such instruction in these disciplines tended to bracket, at least in part, the truth claims of Christianity in favor of more scientific, comparative, and empirical kinds of inquiry. And this was bound to promote standards of instruction and of faculty training more in keeping with a professional academy than with evangelical aspirations and orientations. And this required a further investment in facilities, labs, libraries, equipment, and investment in instructors certified in fields far from the faith and able to teach a larger number of students, not Christian students, to higher academic standards. So what looked to some in the Protestant mission field by the 1930s as a creeping secularization, a move away from the purposes of a Christian college to promote Christianity in China, my grandfather saw it as a necessary move of educational professionalization. And in two furloughs he had in the late 20s and mid-30s, he acquired 4 postdoctorate degrees in education, in psychology, things that didn't have much to do with the propagation of the faith, but had a lot to do with higher educational standards. And thus by the late 1930s, I could watch my grandfather moving on a trajectory of recalibration in his mission work, from evangelism into education, and then within education, moving from training Chinese Christians in colleges and seminaries for church leadership as pastors in an autonomous Christian Church of China, to, as he put it in the mid-30s, the greater problems of higher education in China. What type of college should be developed in China? Who should go to college? What type of instruction should be given with what courses and what kinds of requirements? This was a much broader purview of concern than what he started with. And there are, of course, limits to how far foreign missionaries and their schools could go in an evolution toward an alignment with the nationalist projects of Kuomintang, China, to build a unified and modern China. The model he had of colleges was of liberal arts colleges in the United States. Smaller classes, seminar-style pedagogy, experimental learning, close collaboration between teachers and faculty, which was very American in its provenance. Right? These institutions, however Chinese they may become, were still heavily dependent upon American funding, and many of the faculty, especially in the expanded modern curriculum, were trained in the United States. And my grandfather's mission statement, which he wrote for the Hangzhou Christian College in the early 1930s, to provide a modern curriculum offered in a Christian spirit of love, sacrifice, and service to prepare men, and actually it was co-educational, so women too, I said, to prepare men of the highest moral qualifications, intellectual ability, and practical training to meet the challenges of Chinese society in the future. That statement could be critiqued, and was, by certain Chinese intellectuals as elitist, stressing character development and moral leadership, from which presumably flowed social good and reform as a consequence of high morals and high training, but did not directly attack the poverty and inequality that some felt hobbled China in its attempt to become a unified nation in the modern world. All that said, the development of my grandfather followed, the trajectory of development that he followed with respect to education and mission work in China, placed his career and that of many others, not all, but many others of his generation, in sync with the nation-building project of the new nationalist government. To be sure, building and self-strengthening an independent Chinese nation, which was the aspiration of broad segments of the Chinese intellectual and political leadership and echoed by many Protestant missionaries, and the building of an indigenous Chinese Christian church, the aspiration of foreign and Chinese Christians alike, were not the same thing. but they were on parallel tracks, in sync, working together. And with many abiding cultural blinkers to be sure in play, they were able to act as if they were on the same page. And here I think, as I did this work, that older historical narrative which saw missionaries as running dogs of imperialism, outside forces imposing a cultural imperium on China, has to give way, at least in part, to seeing foreign missionaries and their allies among the educational and political reformers of nationalist China, all of them better trained professionally, all of them committed to institutional building and modern standards in pursuing their parallel projects, as also being caught up in a cultural exchange of mutual engagement across a more mixed and muddled middle ground, hearing, debating, working with and using one another, and becoming in the process, in my reading, both agents of a particular kind of global modernity, which goes to photography and other kinds of modernity, in the first half of the 20th century. Agents of that modernity, but also its early products of that emerging hegemony of that global modernism of the early 20th century. In other words, to think of it less as imperial imposition and anti-imperial resistance, and more in terms of mutual co-production and joint endeavor. That was how I came to see my grandfather and his career. I won't go into the letters, which begin in 1937. He was eventually interned. He ran an educational project in the Taipei internment camp, which had a lot of SAS faculty involved in the teaching. He was only there for about 6 to 8 months before he was exchanged. He came back to the United States a week before I was born. What does any of this have to do with SAS? Fragments. My grandparents arrived in China in 1911, which was the year that a committee of 9 was formed to plan the Shanghai American School. The secretary of that committee of 9 was Mercer Blaine, who was a Southern Presbyterian missionary in Hangzhou, who lived in the same compound at the Heavenly Waters Bridge in Hangzhou that my grandparents lived in their first 15 years in China. I cannot imagine they didn't talk about the school over that 15-year period, as they were both in many ways increasingly involved in education. McMullen was then the Mid-China Mission again, representative on the board of managers of SAS in 1929, 1930, as far as I can tell, it was those dates, and he was chairman of the board of managers in 1931-32, giving out diplomas at the graduation of SAS. 4 of his 5 children attended this Shanghai American School. His oldest daughter, Carolina, my mother, was a graduate in 1930. Her younger brother, John, in 1932. Their younger sister, Emma, in 1934. And the youngest of the 5, Bob Jr., was in the class of 1941, but was pulled out in November 1940 when a lot of children were evacuated because of the danger of war. And I was struck, I don't know how many of you read this history, but I was struck reading this, that my grandfather was involved, it was all the board of managers in 1929-30 involved in a fundraising campaign for SAS. Not a very successful one because of the Depression, but nevertheless, a fundraising campaign. And among other things, they produced a historical pamphlet called Caring for Our Own, in which it was written, removed from their natural environment, growing up amid foreign scenes and acquiring the Eastern conception of life, American children in China are perhaps more in need of the influence of the Little Red Schoolhouse than any boy or girl living in the United States. Now, this extended what everyone has said about SAS, right? That it was designed to be an American island, to be American, thoroughly American in its culture and milieu, and to be a college preparatory school entirely in keeping with an American curriculum. So it was striking to me that just as McMullen, in the same years as this fundraising, was beginning to lead mission colleges, including the Hangzhou Christian College, towards a deeper embeddedness in the Chinese context in which they operated, a closer alignment of missionary educational projects with the nation-building project of the nationalist government. He was also making sure that SAS avoided the stipulations of Chineseness that the government registration of foreign schools required, and ensured that missionary children were buffered against that very same Chinese context in which he was embedding the mission colleges more deeply. He remained in some ways a foreigner, even as he sought to transcend distance and difference. Indeed, fostering an indigenous Chinese Christian church, or fostering a more Chinese-oriented Christian college project, tended to reanimate his own foreignness. That is, to make himself less relevant to the future of Christianity or of education in China, even as he led that movement to doing just that. And in this way, it was just as in the wartime letters that we edited, he railed against extraterritoriality and foreign privileges, even as his foreign status protected him from the deprivations the Japanese wrought on Chinese in the course of that war. So that's what I've learned. Thank you.
So we're going to finish this panel with some remarks from its co-organizer, Professor Joseph Hall.
All right. So we've been looking at the big pictures here. Church institutions, nations, major debates, and now we're going to move down to the ground and look at the American missionary photography and filmmaking during the Second Sino-Japanese War through the lens of missionaries and experience on the ground. I get technology up and running. There we go. All right. So the title of my talk is Framing Chaos, American Missionary Visual Practices and the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945. Now, just to give a kind of ground framework as we begin, it's good to think about wartime China as a fragmented nation, split between nationalist government, communist forces, and the Imperial Japanese military, along with its collaboration state and China's collaborators. And also to think about the war in China as both a regional and a global event, linked to international media and transnational communities, like missionary communities, Americans in China, and so forth. And to think about, in all of this big context, American missionaries and their wartime visual practices as existing between nations, between localities and in localities, and between and in imperial powers. And looking even closer at images as representations of historical events on the one hand, as well as the effects of historical change upon American visual practices in China and historical contingency affecting images. So we'll jump right into the war. In July of 1937, the Japanese military invaded North China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and war also broke out around Shanghai as the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy landed in Shanghai and began to move inland along with forces from the north. And as we zoom in, we can look at this portion of China, Shanghai on the east, Nanjing in the middle, the capital at the time of China, and Hankou, a major city in China as the nationalist government retreated in the face of the Japanese invasion. Now, if you were to open up and go into a newsstand in 1937-38, you would have seen on May 16th this photograph entitled "A Defender of China," a large photo enlarged on the cover of Life magazine, taken in the city of Hankou in the west, where the nationalist government had retreated. Now, this photograph was taken by this very handsome man, Robert Capa, a photojournalist with Life magazine, who's Hungarian, better known for his only photographs of D-Day, taken in 1944 as he landed with the first wave of troops on Omaha Beach during the invasion. But at this point in China, and in China's history, he was embedded in Hankou as a photojournalist, unable to get pictures of the war itself. He primarily focused on getting pictures of military parades and demonstrations organized by the national government. He missed one major battle, the Battle of Tai'er Zhuang, when his nationalist handler allowed him to sleep through the battle and get pictures only afterwards. He was extremely frustrated by this inability to get pictures on the scene. But there was someone else on the scene. If you were to look at this magazine and turn the page and leaf through it, you would come across this page. And these are the first pictures of the rape of Nanjing, or the Nanjing Massacre, to reach American audiences on a global scale, published in Life magazine in May of 1938. And these pictures were taken behind Japanese lines in Nanjing after the Japanese occupation in December. They were taken by an American missionary, an Episcopal missionary, named John G. McGee. And the caption that followed these pictures read, "These 10 pictures were taken after the Japanese occupation of Nanjing, December 13th. The photographer was an American missionary whose name must be concealed. He used a 16mm amateur movie camera carefully hidden from Japanese eyes. The most dreadful pictures of the rape of Nanjing this amateur photographer could not take. He knew that if he filmed civilians being shot down or houses looted and burned, he would be arrested and his camera smashed. Besides, he was too busy, like other foreign missionaries and doctors, saving what civilians he could." Now, John McGee is the man standing at the right side with the fedora on the top step, and he was a member of the Committee of the International Red Cross in Nanjing, with the retreat of the nationalist government. Foreigners who were kind of left behind in Nanjing attempted to organize refugee efforts, medical care, and also venturing to Japanese-occupied areas to pull out, or at least to give some kind of aid to the Chinese civilians who were really brutalized by the Japanese military. Estimates range from 40,000 to 300,000 Chinese men, women, and children killed or tortured during this time by the military. And there was a media battle going on the ground at this time between missionaries with cameras. And it's interesting that the missionaries sent in long lists of reports to the US State Department listing property that had been stolen or destroyed. And among things as varied as jelly glasses and dresser drawers, they did not include cameras, because they kept those cameras with them. And they tried as much as they could to take pictures on the ground of what was going on. And there were, in fact, debates that I found in the archive between the Japanese Consul General and American missionaries, including a man named Louis Smythe, whose last name some of you may recognize, and Minor Seal Bates, who were in Nanjing, taking pictures and then being stopped by the Japanese military, their film torn out of their cameras and exposed to light in an effort to contain this media coverage of these missionaries. And there were posters plastered all over Nanjing and other occupied cities claiming the benevolence of the Japanese military, even as these atrocities were going on literally sometimes in the houses right next door. And the world had already been exposed to images, horrors and images of violence from China, including the very famous Bloody Saturday photograph taken by a newsreel photographer, H.S. Wang, in Shanghai after it was bombed by the Japanese military. And this crying baby, many of you may have seen, reproduced over and over again in various Western magazines and other sources around the world. But interestingly, even as all of this was going on, as the missionaries are attempting in cases around occupied China to document the atrocities or other violence, there was this, as Charlie mentioned earlier, Christian internationalism in thinking more broadly about what these images could do. And this caption accompanied the films that were smuggled out of Nanjing by a YMCA secretary, films shot by John McGee and using his movie camera, and sent to Shanghai, where they were screened for the first time in the community church across the street from SAS in 1938 by the YMCA secretary. And there was a woman in there named Muriel Lester, who was with the British Fellowship of Reconciliation. And this note was accompanying the films, and she asked to take them to Japan to show the Japanese Christians. And the caption read, "These pictures have been taken with no thought of stirring up a spirit of revenge against the Japanese, but with a desire to make all people, Japanese included, realize how horrible this war has been, and to determine that every legitimate means should be used to stop this conflict manufactured by the Japanese military." The photographer, John McGee, the Episcopal missionary, has often been to Japan and knows how beautiful that country is and how many noble people are to be found there. if the people of Japan could really know how the war was made and how it was conducted, a vast number of them would be horrified. So this attempt to use the film as a missionary agent of peace and of revelation of war violence was accompanying the film materials as they traveled to Japan. Unfortunately, due to political pressure by the government and other contingencies, the film was screened for a small group of Japanese Christians, but no action was taken. Another German diplomat, John Rabe, took the film, copies of the film, to screen among German and Nazi officials back in Germany to show them not to support the Japanese government, and this was also put down by the Gestapo. So this was also a failed attempt. But in these failed attempts, there was this effort to use missionary images to expose this violence and to transmit it around the world, across national borders and across regions. And interestingly, the debate over some of these images continues today. This is not an image taken by missionaries, but you can see that the Chinese baby, the Shanghai photograph, is now used by some Japanese nationalists in current right-wing discussions over the role of Japan in the war. And this picture has been reproduced, and the comic book artist, Kobayashi Yoshinori, claims that the photograph was a fake, and that it was used by Life magazine to brainwash American audiences into opposing Japan during the war. So this debate continues. And the camera that John McGee used now sits in the Nanjing Massacre Museum behind a glass case, where, with copies of that fateful page, it is so viewed by people as evidence of visual traces of the massacre and of the person on the ground with a camera who had documented it. And just in part of my research, I work on technology. I've been able to collect the exact camera that was used by John McGee, and I narrowed it down. The lenses are the same, everything's the same. I've restored this camera, and it works still, so you can go ahead and pass it around. And you can imagine yourself in the steps of John McGee, running around Nanjing with his camera, with the motor running, attempting to get this footage as the atrocities are going on. Now, John McGee was not the only missionary in China to have a camera, and I love this image. This image is from the album of a person you may know well, Bob Hankey. And this picture, if you look at it at first glance, just shows a group of Presbyterian missionaries in June 1936 having a good time in North China. But when you enlarge the picture, you can tell that there are cameras, at least 4 of them, embedded in the picture. I use little red arrows to point out who is holding a camera, and the 4th camera is the one making the image. So these missionaries were already equipped with cameras from the early 20th century onward, and have been using them now for documentation as opposed to documenting missionary practice, now turning to wartime practice. And I'll jump very quickly into a couple of examples of the ways that the war affected missionary imaging. And moving west to Sichuan and Chongqing and Chengdu, as the nationalist government retreated, missionaries, Protestant and Catholic, followed in the wake of the net government's retreat, and also made images of nationalist war efforts, propaganda campaigns, military demonstrations, athletic events. I think this is a sporting event with all the athletes pledging allegiance to the nationalist government in West China. These pictures were taken by a Presbyterian medical educator who was, his name was Gerald Winfield, who works in microbiology and parasitiology at Qilu University in North China, and retreated to West China to continue his medical work there, and also produced film strips using his technological expertise, and film strips being commonly used in medical demonstrations and projection. He used that technology and that expertise to make propaganda film strips for the nationalist government, and this one was reproduced also in Life magazine, and it's a comic strip, almost Disney-like, telling the story of different birds banding together to fight the aggressor, the blackbird, which is Japan. And in the end, the American eagle and the Chinese nationalist sparrow shake hands as they've defeated the Japanese blackbird. So it's interesting that they use this film strip technology in comic ways, but also public outreach to demonstrate these kinds of political and nationalistic themes. And they even trained large teams of Chinese projectionists to go out with SVE, or Society of Visual Education, projectors fired by kerosene into the Chinese countryside to screen these film strips for Chinese audiences, many of whom were illiterate or unable to otherwise engage with technologies like radio and the newspaper. And moving now back into occupied China to look at another effect of Japanese military occupation upon American missionary imaging, it's interesting that after the government retreated, the central government, the nationalist government retreated, the Japanese in some areas became the central security force, taking care of logistics and other kinds of institutional practices in places that were originally filled by the nationalist government. And in these times, there was a strange alliance, one you can sometimes friendship, but there was a need for missionaries to continue working under occupation, even as the rest of the war was going on. And you get photographs of missionaries together. One of the two missionaries, one of them is Bob Hankey's father, Harold Eugene Hankey on the left side, and Ralph Charles Lewis, Harry Lewis, Ralph's son, is sitting right here in the front row. And they were visited by Japanese officers and provided medical care for Chinese and Japanese military and civilian personnel on the ground, and often witnessed the back and forth battles between communist forces in North China and the Japanese. Japanese soldiers crying as they marched out of the city where the missionaries were based, knowing that they would be massacred by the communists and the guerrillas in the north. So there was a very visceral and on-the-ground experience that lies behind these images of missionaries and sometimes Japanese officers together in the frame. And the picture of the Japanese officer on the right-hand side is a personal portrait given as a gift to the Hankeys of a young infantryman whose name is lost to history when he happened to be in the area as an occupation troop and befriended the missionaries during that time. These people you also may recognize. This is the Scoville family. The picture of Frederick Scoville and Myra Scoville, and many of the Scoville siblings are here today in the audience back there. Carl, Jim, and Anne are in this photograph here. But it's interesting, the war is also leaving its own marks on the images. If you take a look at this normal photograph of a Presbyterian family in their mission station and turn it over, it's stamped with a mark of a Japanese military censor on the back who has opened the envelope, determined that the photograph is good for mailing, stamped it with his seal, and sent it on for posting to the United States. So even as these missionaries are taking pictures of life under occupation, the occupation itself is marking physically the photographs that they're sending around the world. Now, on December 7th, 1941, the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Several time zones away, the missionaries and others in China were asleep in their houses. The morning of December 8th, Japanese troops arrived on the scene to place many of the missionaries under house arrest in their compounds in their cities across north and eastern China. And even here, after the missionaries are interned or are put under house arrest, later to be interned in civilian assembly camps, as some of you were during the war, photography did continue. Frederick Scoville, the Scoville father, used up the last of his Kodachrome 35mm color film, taking pictures of the courtyard in which his family were put under house arrest in their house. And these images, even though, again, on first glance, don't seem to be much of direct interest, they're taken by missionaries under house arrest who are confined to this limited area. Even the frame of the picture seems to suggest this very limited perspective as the missionaries are stuck in this spot waiting for further word whether they'll be transferred to a camp or they'll be sent back to the United States. And this entire political situation is very uncertain from the point of view of the missionaries. But even as the missionaries were stuck under house arrest and later transferred to camps, parts of their visual material was moving around the world. The Scovilles, or Frederick and Myra Scoville, before they were transferred to Weixian, the civilian assembly camp in the north, shot an 8mm color movie film using a movie camera and sent it through Japanese lines using the Chinese Postal Service, which was still operating between occupied and unoccupied areas, where their film went from Jining, in Shandong province, to Chongqing through the Postal Service and was loaded on perhaps a mail plane and sent across the Himalayas to India, where it was loaded on a ship and sent across the Atlantic to the only place in the world that could process Kodachrome, which was Rochester, New York, and where in 28 separate steps, 3.5 hours, 3 different processing machines, their film, which we will see right now, was processed by Eastman Kodak. And I believe that's Carl or Jim bent over the desk writing. I think that's Anne. There's Tom Scoble over there, baby. Let's see. Oh, Judy, there you are, right? It's interesting that this whole movie of life in a missionary family under occupation as all of this is going on. And this attempt to show life as normal, yet under all of this pressure on the outside. And I think that's Jim riding his bicycle, and Carl. And again, I have permission from the schools to show this, so I hope I'm not embarrassing them too much. But the idea that even under occupation, there are contacts between American and Chinese Christians, and in the area, a small staff was allowed to stay on hand at the mission to assist with day-to-day activities, and they become part of the filmic record, including the family. So in a way, they are part of this missionary family that is embedded in this film under occupation. And I should say, interestingly, after the Scobles were interned at Weixian, they were repatriated on the Gripsol, headed back home to the United States. And after they landed, first of all, Myra Scoble was pregnant when she was in the concentration camp. And when she landed, she gave birth hours after landing to Vicky Scoble, who is there here today. One of the Scobles to be born right after disembarking from the Gripsol. And as things go, the film was left at Eastman Kodak for lack of a forwarding address. There was nowhere to send it. And then, by chances, providence, whatever you may call it, fate, Frederick Scoble became the company physician at Rochester, at Eastman Kodak, and some Kodak employee tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Scoble, is this your film?" And the maker of the film and the subjects of the film itself, were reunited by chance in Rochester, New York, in 1943. So, again, returning from these materials to these big issues, we can really see through this visual material and representations that American missionaries and their wartime visual practices existed between nation and imperial power. They embodied mixed identities, embeddedness, and visions of modern experience in East Asia. And thinking about the images themselves, we can look at them as windows onto history, providing these really rare perspectives, while they themselves were shaped by history as well. And I'll leave you with this quote taken by a photographer who was not embedded, Robert Capa, who in 1938, as he was leaving China, going back to the United States, wrote a letter to his brother Cornell. And he wrote, "The spirit of the Chinese people has so far resisted one of the heaviest storms of their times. They have weathered it. Just think how much it may mean one day when this Chinese initiative is used for tasks other than to resist the brunt of enemy attack." The photographer proved prophetic. Thank you.
Okay, so as the chair of this panel, I'm now asked to field questions to the three panelists. Any questions? Yes?
I wonder how you might obtain copies of Dr. Yuan's report, very interesting report.
I couldn't quite hear.
I'm sorry, how can we obtain copies, particularly of the reports of your grandfather?
Right. So how can we obtain copies of reports of grandfather of Charles Wright that he presented on?
Sorry, excuse me.
Well, Joe and I put together this book that's coming out this year with the letters from wartime, 37, 38. And I've written a, gosh, how how long was it? 100-page introduction to the guy's career. So all the stuff that was in that talk is in that essay. So it's coming out, Lehigh University Press. It's called War and Occupation in China. I'm not sure when, but sometime this year.
Next question?
Yeah. Follow up on that. Is your talk today available? I saw you were reading from notes. Is there any chance to
I
get a
got
copy?
notes. I wrote a lot of it on the plane last night.
Did everybody hear that? So the question was whether the notes that form the basis of Charles Wright's talk
Whether they
were
might be available. Or a transcript if somebody's recording. But that was a wonderful summary of that time. My father knew.
We don't have a microphone, so that's why I'm running around the room, fielding questions and then trying to broadcast them. Other questions? Okay, first you.
My father was interned at Wei Shen and was exchanged. He was a businessman, and I had thought that businessmen were exchanged for Japanese businessmen. But I learned just now that missionaries got exchanged. How did the people who were selected for exchange with the Japanese occur? Does anybody know that?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay.
You talk about problems taking chance. I went to a tea party once in Sherburne, Massachusetts, and ended up talking to a gentleman with a slightly European accent. It turns out he was the Swiss Cross representative in Shanghai who took the list from the various camps and made the selection. It was the Swiss Red Cross, being technically a neutral nation, that arranged this in communication with governments on both sides. So,
What I was
Do you know
told
what
by
criteria he used?
my uncle was interned. He was a businessman, and he was interned in Bhutan. And he said there was a list they followed. First of all, if you were married and had children, you got to the top of the list. If you were married, you went to the list, and if you were a bachelor, you didn't get on the list.
it had, I think, 15 categories. And they got down, as far as I know, to category 13. I don't know who was in 14 and 15. But as it ended up, families that had elected to be separated if necessary still made it because they got down to the category of families that had elected to stay together. Because you had a choice. The father could elect to be in a category so that his wife and children were in category 2, but they could also elect to stay together. And so people made these decisions, and they were sorting out. It wasn't an entirely smooth process. We almost didn't get on. We were told just for reasons agreeable to your government and mine, you're not going, because we didn't show up on the list. And the interpreter at our camp took it on himself to go to headquarters to find out why we weren't on the list. And as the last buses were loading up to go to the ship, my father was called upstairs and said, "Would you still want to go? And can you be ready in an hour?" And he said, "I can be ready in half an hour." And we were on the last one there. And what had happened, it turned out, was that, yes, headquarters, they said, "Oh yeah, the Standards are going. They're coming up from Zhaoxing." We had been up from Zhaoxing for 6 months. But bureaucratic things can go awry. So we were very lucky to be on that last Gripsholm trip. And that's where Carl and I met for the first time. And he doesn't remember it, but we organized a shoe shine business on the Gripsholm. My only venture into private enterprise. And we ended up losing 2 pairs of shoes and coming out behind.
Before we have a break, I think we have quite room for 2 more questions. So first you, and then you.
Okay, I wondered whether they would have interned many people if we hadn't interned all the Japanese in the U.S. first. And I don't know the answer to that question, but that was the idea of why they were repatriated so fast. They wanted to show that they wanted to get their people back because they were all up the Pacific Northwest. And they lost their farms quite a bit from that move. I'm not saying it was wrong or right, but that's what happened. And I think the Japanese they had their enemies list when they came into Shanghai. People like C.B. Starr, people, J.B. Powell, all those people who wrote the truth, they wanted to get at them. And so that I don't know whether they would have had quite as much internment if we hadn't done it too.
So that's been a very interesting remark. And then final question?
I was just going to ask out of curiosity, sir, do you know if your grandfather was involved in any kind of reform as far as education in North Carolina? Because he is quite, well, you could argue as progressive-minded as missionaries go in China, but did he transfer that progressive-minded?
He came back on the group home in 43 and was made the interim president of Center College in Danville, Virginia, and he was there for 2.5 years as president of that college. And then he went to New York and served on the board of Christian colleges in China, which was the organizational support for all these colleges in China, raising money and stuff. And then he retired to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and did some teaching on the campus there, and was involved in a big civil rights controversy at the church he was at. He was this interim pastor. And there was a way in which all the family that went to China took one side of the civil rights struggle, and all the family who did not go to China took the other side. And it's a very interesting legacy, I think, of having spent a lifetime in another culture with people not of the same race and of different languages, that their position on civil rights was instinctively on the side of change. And the people who had not gone in the family were instinctively on the other side.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're now reached the end of the first panel.